Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House considers residential leaseholders and interim fire safety costs. It is a pleasure to be back in Westminster Hall and to be able to debate such an important topic today. When I became the MP for Vauxhall in 2019, 2.5 years after the horrific Grenfell fire tower, I did not expect to find that so many of my constituents were still living in unsafe buildings, blighted by dangerous cladding and other fire safety defects. To date, I have received and been contacted by over 250 individual leaseholders living in 27 different unsafe building developments in my constituency. And this is just in Vauxhall. The sheer scale of this cladding scandal is truly shocking, and it has revealed the full extent of what can only be described as a systematic failure in building safety in this country. And because of the tireless efforts of campaigners and their supporters up and down the country, we know that safety is only one part of this story. Leaseholders who have bought their homes in good faith now find themselves saddled with the financial responsibility and the liability for problems they had absolutely no part in creating. Much has been said recently about this injustice, and I'm grateful to colleagues across the House who have called for urgent action to protect innocent leaseholders. And understandably, much of the debate has focused on who should pay for the cost of the remedial works to remove and replace this cladding. But I want to draw attention to an equally urgent, but much less talked about, financial aspect of this crisis. That is the eye-watering charges that are being passed on to leaseholders for compulsory interim fire safety measures whilst they wait for the remediation work to be completed. Interim costs have life-changing impacts. The sheer feeling of hopelessness is shared by many leaseholders I've spoken to. One constituent wrote to me, "I have worked hard. I have contributed to the communities in which I've lived. I have paid over £100,000 in taxes over the past 3 years. And yet, I now find myself facing potential bankruptcy, homelessness, and the collapse of my business through no fault of my own. My future is utterly bleak, and my life feels worthless." As soon as a building is assessed as being unsafe, residents are told that they must immediately introduce additional fire safety protocols or face an evacuation order from the fire brigade. These interim measures can be met in 2 ways. 1, by appointing a wake-in watch, where trained wardens continually patrol the building to detect a fire. And 2, the installation of specialist alarm systems. Faced with homelessness, leaseholders have little choice but to assume these costs. These interim measures have become frequent as the fire safety crisis has unravelled over the last 3.5 years. Every week, new buildings are being discovered to be unsafe. And worryingly, this fire safety assessment is generally only triggered when the leaseholder tries to remortgage or sell, which in turn triggers the external wall survey or the now infamous EWS1 process. This actually means that the true scale of this problem is still unknown, and it will only grow in the months and years ahead. There is currently nothing in law to protect leaseholders from the financial responsibilities for these interim measures, which are typically passed on through increased service charges. The data on interim cost is patchy and incomplete. Government figures show that the average estimated cost for wake-in watch in England is £17,000 per block, rising to over £20,000 in London. Per household, this translates to a bill of approximately £500 a month for each affected household. And the alarm systems are not much cheaper as an alternative, with the estimates ranging from £50,000 and £150,000 depending on the size of the building. These figures are eye-watering, and they will recur month after month, year after year, until the cladding is removed and the building is deemed completely safe. In February of this year, the Minister for Housing told Parliament, and I quote, "We are clear that wake-and watch regimes should only ever be used in the short term." Yet in one development in the Kennington area of my constituency, they have been paying for wake-and watch since July of last year at a cost of £10,000 per flat. With remediation works not expected to be completed before the end of next year, and an alarm system deemed insufficient to meet the danger, the total cost for these interim measures for this one particular development are currently estimated to reach over £1 million. And what really sticks in the throats for my constituents is not just that these interim measures are expensive and mandatory, but the effectiveness has been called into question. One constituent told me, "These guys add little practical value and sit around watching TV on their phones, and yet we have to pay for them under the threat of being evicted if we don't. In a fire, they are not really going to be able to make a blind bit of difference to evacuating residents." Colleagues, we have to remember that these interim measures are a daily reminder to our constituents that the building they are living in is unsafe. These are amounts that are unaffordable for most people at any stage in their life, but many of those affected are young first-time buyers whose dreams of home ownership has turned into an unaffordable nightmare, with their homes literally unsellable, and industry experts estimating that it will take between 5 and 15 years for all affected buildings to be remediated. The truth is that these costs are anything but interim. Ministers have known about this problem for almost 4 years now. They have repeatedly acknowledged that these fire safety defects are not the fault of leaseholders. And yet it took the Secretary of State until December last year to announce any sort of help for interim cost. The Wake and Watch Relief Fund, which offers the grant to pay for the installation of fire alarm systems, was a welcome step in the right direction. But it remains the only form of government assistance available for interim costs. And in its current form, the fund's provisions are partial and insufficient. Firstly, leaseholders living in blocks below 18 metres tall are excluded from applying. The government claims that this is because the risk of the life-threatening fire in lower buildings is smaller. But any building which faces an evacuation order if the interim measures are not established is, by definition, clearly not safe, whether it's 18, 15 or 12 metres. One such block in Vauxhall, under 18 metres, failed its EWS1 assessment in October 2020, and its leaseholders have had to find over £170,000 to pay for interim safety measures. It is estimated that the remediation work will cost in total £1.4 million. The developer of that building has gone out of business, and they are all excluded from any government support schemes. Colleagues, I simply do not know how this situation could ever be fair. Even if we just focus our attention on those buildings over 18 metres that can apply for the fund, the £30 million that the government has allocated is drastically short of what is needed. The government estimates that this will pay for a maximum of 460 buildings. But there are at least 560 eligible buildings in London alone. Lord Greenhalgh acknowledged at the HCLG Select Committee hearing on Monday of this week, when he said, "We recognise that the 30 million goes some way, but not all the way." And finally, the fund only pays for alarm system purchased and installed after December 2020. This totally ignores the thousands of pounds that leaseholders have already spent on compulsory and expensive but ineffective wake and watch systems. How can this be right or fair? The government has repeatedly said in the House that no leaseholder should pay, and that includes my right honourable friend the Minister. So I must ask the Minister if we both agree that in principle innocent leaseholders should not be responsible for solving the problems they didn't cause. Why are we asking these same leaseholders to pay for these extortionate sums for interim costs? I'm very grateful to the Minister for attending the debate today, and I want to conclude my remarks by focusing on what can be done to fix this appalling situation. Specifically, I have 4 questions for the Minister, and I'd be grateful if he could answer each of them in turn. Will the government agree to the principle that no leaseholder should have to pay for interim fire safety measures to mitigate the problems they did not cause? Will the government commit to including provisions within the upcoming Building Safety Bill to protect leaseholders from these costs and ensure that they are picked up by the people who were responsible for causing them in the first place? Will the government immediately extend the Wake and Watch Relief Fund to match the number of buildings that we know are affected and make sure that all leaseholders facing these costs can apply regardless of building heights? The Minister has previously said that interim measures should only be used temporarily, and I quote, because they are an entirely inadequate substitute for mediation. With this in mind, will the Minister ask the government to mandate a timetable for the completion of the remediation work in all unsafe blocks to make sure that the interim costs do not have to be paid by leaseholders for years to come? Thank you, Chair.
The question is that this House has considered residential leaseholders and interim fire safety costs. The debate will last until 10:55. I intend to call the opposition spokesman no later than 10:32, the Minister at 10:42, and then Florence Eshalomi will have 2 or 3 minutes to sum up the debate at the end. There are 16 backbenchers seeking to contribute. I want to make sure that everyone gets in, so I'm afraid I'll have to impose a time limit. So if we all aim for 3 minutes, then everybody should have their say, and all those members participating virtually should have a countdown clock on their screens. So we'll start off with Steve McPartland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to record my thanks to the Member of Parliament for Vauxhall for securing this very important debate. And she spoke so eloquently and movingly about some of the tragic stories that she's heard in her constituency in London. Sadly, these stories are reflected in my constituency and also constituencies up and down the country. The costs of intermediate wake and watch measures, insurance premiums going up thousands of %. They're just heartbreaking. People are going bankrupt as we speak, as we have these debates. And the government does not seem to be listening to the howls of pain from leaseholders up and down the country as they're begging for support and assistance. We're 3.5, almost 4 years on from Grenfell, and we're not getting this right. We're not helping. The government is unfortunately making the situation worse by not working with leaseholders and the relevant groups, such like UK Cladding Action Group, End Our Cladding Scandal, and the variety of brilliant recommendations that are being made by the Select Committee, chaired by our wonderful colleague who's here in the debate today. It's imperative that we help these leaseholders. When we look at insurance premiums as a measure, which a lot of people don't recognise, they may have gone up 2,000–3,000%. And actually, the government's taking 12% in insurance premium tax on those measures. So the insurance premium tax take on those insurance premiums is actually currently higher than the insurance premiums were themselves a year or two ago. It's astonishing. Waking watch, the fire service have told us they have almost no control over waking watchers. Waking watch is not new. Waking watch is something that was introduced years ago if a hotel fire alarm didn't work, but at the moment they're being used by management companies as the first resort instead of a last resort, and as a result our local fire services don't have any ability to go in and help these leaseholders who are being told, well, you need to have a waking watch. There's no other options for them, and the fire service should be given some powers to actually be involved in what's a responsible waking watch when it's needed, what other evacuation orders or measures could be put in place. But the costs are just staggering. I mean, I have constituents in Vista Tower in Stevenage paying £15,000 a week, and they just cannot afford that. It's impossible for them. It's almost as much as some of their mortgage payments, and they're going bankrupt now. I urge the minister, please listen to the pain of leaseholders up and down the country. Stop talking, start doing, start helping my constituents and those up and down the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Kate Osamor.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm pleased to serve under your chairmanship, Mr. Holbrook, and I look forward to doing so again. I want to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, on securing today's important debate. My constituents in Edmonton, who live in Prowse Court, Golden Lion Court and Brickland Court, watched the Chancellor's speech last week and were left very disappointed. There was not one mention of cladding or fire safety in the budget. Leaseholders, like my constituent Jason and his wife, moved into their flat in 2007 with their daughter. In January this year, a fire safety assessment concluded that the cladding on Jason's building needed to be removed. Jason and his fellow tenants have no idea how long they're going to be waiting for the removal and who will meet the costs of that work. All they are certain of is that the interim safety measures must be put in place, including increased fire risk assessment and additional heat detectors. The freeholder of Jason's building has already begun passing down the cost of those measures in the form of increased insurance and service charge costs. Leaving Jason in debt, unable to move, stuck in an unsafe building, which is costing them more and more. Jason goes to sleep every night knowing that his family is not safe and there is no end in sight to this worry. To put it simply, they are trapped. I have raised identical cases with the Secretary of State for Housing and Communities and Local Government to ask that the government fully fund interim safety costs, fire safety costs. In reply, the government seemed only focused on ensuring that remediation work must be completed first. It is incredibly unjust to penalise those who did not cause this cladding scandal to have to wait for remediation work to be completed first, whereas allowing the property developers to get to walk away bearing no interim costs or seemingly long-term costs. I hope in the summing up, the Minister will carefully consider what has been said in this debate and ensure that moving forward, not only does the government meet its obligations and fully fund interim safety costs, so that not one leaseholder is left out of pocket, but that the Minister fully acknowledges that the cladding scandal needs to be treated as the national emergency that it truly is. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Holloway. A pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I congratulate the honourable member for Vauxhall for securing this debate, and indeed a pleasure to follow colleagues from Stevenage and Edmonton in highlighting the concerns that there are in this debate. I wish to concentrate on two particular areas given the circumstances. First is the issue of cladding in tall buildings. Clearly, I congratulate the government on securing funding to help remediate that cladding. But the problem is that in tall buildings, the cost of removing cladding is dwarfed often by the cost of fire safety measures that have to be implemented as well. And it's quite clear, as things stand, that leaseholders are going to be saddled with the costs of the fire safety measures that are required, as well as their cladding. I would be grateful if my right honourable friend in his summing up could actually answer the issue of what exactly is included in the remediation of cladding. Because at the HCLG Select Committee, there was some confusion when it was suggested that external areas which are not involved in the cladding, such as different balconies, etc., will now be included in the grant scheme. The other problem is that once a fire assessment takes place, we're told now that the remediation grants will not be available unless leaseholders sign up to fixing the fire safety issues as well. And these are eye-watering sums of money. Now, the arrangements, of course, are complex because leaseholders, I think we all agree, should not have to pay for the remediation. But then the issue is who should. I take the view that the taxpayer should not be paying for this, but the developers, the building owners, and indeed the suppliers of materials should be paying for the fire safety remediation as well as the remediation of unsafe cladding. There's no doubt that the testing regime was unfit for purpose at the time, but emerging evidence from the Grenfell inquiry suggests that that manufacturers deliberately decided to use the position of the testing to cheat on the system, and if so, they should be forced to carry out the remediation at their cost. Equally, we have the challenge of insurance, the mortgages, and the values of properties that are affected. And clearly, at the moment, leaseholders cannot be expected to wait for the building safety bill to be introduced in Parliament. It'll take more than 2 years for that to come into operation, and leaseholders cannot wait. So we need clarity on the position that the fees and costs will be picked up and that the leaseholders will not have to pay for that cost. We also know it's going to take an extended period of time for this work to be carried out. So, Mr. Hollowbone, I'll rest my remarks there and hope that we actually get a response from the Minister on exactly what is covered under this scheme.
Thank you. In a moment, I will call Dame Margaret Hodge. The speaker after Dame Margaret has withdrawn, so after Dame Margaret, we'll then go to Hilary Benn. Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Chair, and warm congratulations to my honourable friend for securing this important debate. In June 2019, a devastating fire tore through the timber balconies of Samuel Garside House in Barking. Residents lost their homes, their possessions, and even their pets, and they now live in fear, suffering sleepless nights and constant anxiety. These residents were the first of many constituents impacted by the cladding scandal who have sought my help. Leaseholders in Barking and Dagenham aren't wealthy. Many live hand to mouth, and most can't even afford contents insurance. Cladding has turned their dream of buying a home into a living nightmare. They face ongoing costs for interim safety measures, and they can't afford those. Massive bills for waking watches, building insurance, EWS surveys, and they can't sell or remortgage their homes. At Academy Central, residents have paid $3,500 per household per year for a waking watch. Many can't afford it, and they've been doing 24-hour patrol themselves, placing huge strain on their lives. At Rivermill Lofts, leaseholders have struggled to get an EWS survey. They've been quoted hundreds of pounds per flat, and only 70% of the households have paid up. In the meantime, their flats are worthless. At the Rope Works, building insurance shot up from 70,000 to 650,000. That's 900% in 2 years. At Barking Central, bills for interim measures have reached 6,500 per home. A third of leaseholders can't afford that, and the cladding grant they hope to get won't cover the costs of dealing with things like flammable insulation or faulty fire breaks. Many leases are buy-to-let, and the landlords often just don't care. At Arboretum Place, only 5 people turned up to discuss a way forward, and the owner-occupiers can't even begin to sort out the mess if the landlords won't engage. Responsibilities are diffuse, Chair. Ownership is often shady, and stakeholders shirk their obligations. I've had freeholders refusing point blank to even consider that they have a moral duty to help, developers refusing to turn up to meetings, and insurers profiteering. The government said that leaseholders should not have to pay, but it's government action, not warm words, that my leaseholders need. Developers, freeholders, builders, manufacturers, regulators, they should all contribute, but only the government can force them to do so. And there are still too many gaps in the support package: insufficient funding, arbitrary height thresholds, unaffordable loans, ignoring all the other defects. Mr. Chairman, this issue will not go away. We won't let it until the government acts in a comprehensive and thorough way so that the homes are made safe and the leaseholders are not forced to foot the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Hilary Benn. Is Sir Robert Neill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holloway. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the honourable member for Vauxhall for securing this debate. The government has done a great deal. I recognise that in terms of the money and the funding that has been made available. But I equally have to say that this is not enough. And it's not enough because the quantum of money available isn't adequate, and also because it doesn't cover all of the consequences of the regulatory failure that has put many people, including constituents of mine, in an impossible situation. And so it's going to be necessary, I think, for the government to look again at this. And let me explain why that's important. We've already heard of the dire position that many flat owners are placed in. And many of these are people who have done the right thing in many ways. They have sought to buy their own homes. They've done the things, dare I say to the minister, that my party has urged them to do. But now they feel cut adrift. And many of those are people at the lower end of the income scale. Many of those who bought these properties as their entry into the housing market. Some key statistics show that, for example, some 59% of the homeowners caught in this situation have an income of less than £50,000. 33% have an income of less than £35,000. When they are being hit with massive tens of thousands of pound bills, that is not very much on properties which are unmortgageable or unsaleable. In the case of North Point, in my constituency, residents have collectively paid over £500,000 on a waking watch, on top of 120,000 for the installation of a temporary fire alarm. And in some cases, evidence shows that people are paying up to £50,000 a month. And as has been observed, insurance premiums have shot through the roof. We've seen examples where in one London block, the premium increased from 130,000 to 690,000. And that is despite the fact, in some cases, those buildings have been approved by the department for the ACM remediation scheme. They've put alarms in place, but nonetheless, frankly, the insurance industry has made unreasonable and unjustified levels of profits, and they need to put their house in order too. We do need to pursue those at fault in the cladding scandal, the contractors, the builders, but that will take time. That may take years. The leaseholders need help with cash flow, and that's why the government should be making available not just grants, but also loans, but that can then be recouped against those who are ultimately responsible. Only government has the cash flow to get these people moving again, enable them to move on with their lives, because there's not just an economic cost, there's a massive personal and social one for these victims of the cladding scandal too.
Chair, I hope you can hear me now.
We can hear you, and now would be a really good time to hear your contribution. Hilary Benn.
I do apologise. I join others in congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, on securing this debate and for talking so passionately, as have others, about the unaffordable cost to our constituents of waking watches and insurance bills. We all know these are costs to pay for the symptom of the problem. They will never remedy the problem itself, but they will eventually end up bankrupting people. My constituent, Hayley Tillotson, saved up for 4 years to buy her flat. She called it the proudest moment of her life. Just before Christmas, she had to declare herself bankrupt and hand back the keys to her dream home. Why? Because the waking watch fee was the same as her mortgage and she didn't have the money to pay for it. And the point I simply want to make this morning is this. Despite the steps the government has taken, without something else happening, these so-called interim costs will continue to be demanded in the months and the years ahead because the buildings will not have been made completely safe. Why is that? Because we know that dangerous cladding is only part of the problem. The other part, wooden balconies and walkways and flammable insulation and missing fire breaks, are things that time and time again have been discovered as innocent leaseholders learn that their block wasn't even constructed to the building standards at the time. Now, the minister knows perfectly well that the leaseholders don't have the money to fix these other fire safety defects. Now, the Secretary of State, when pressed on this, said the taxpayer couldn't be expected to meet the cost of fixing any safety defect on any building of any height. It's a fair point. Although successive governments do bear some responsibility because they presided over this scandal, but the people who really should pay, the developers, the builders, the freeholders, should be asked for the money, and the government's created the means through the tax and the levy that were announced by the Secretary of State. Provide loans to fix the problem, recoup the money from those three sources. Now, I am grateful to the Minister for his reply to my written question about whether works to remove dangerous cladding funded by the BSF will be delayed if insufficient funds are not available to fix the other fire safety problems. There was a press report that suggested this could happen. The Minister's reply implied that it would not. Could he just clarify this in responding? But the fact remains, until sufficient funds are identified, these costs will continue to drain the resources and the spirits of all those leaseholders caught up in this nightmare. So the question to the Minister remains a very simple one. He knows that leaseholders can't afford to fix these other problems. So what is his plan for getting them fixed? Thank you.
Thank you. We now go to John McDonnell.
Can I thank my honourable friend for Vauxhall for securing this debate and also just say how impressive her introduction was, and it's a reflection of, I think, the immense talent she brought to the House itself. I'm speaking very briefly because I promised my constituents who live at the Ballymore development at High Point Village in Hayes that I would take every opportunity I could to raise their concerns, because it's virtually impossible, as other members have said, to describe the distress that my constituents have experienced and are going through. It started not just the day after Grenfell when they were concerned about their own safety, but the fact that it took a long time to get a thorough inspection underway. And then after that, the developer itself, I think, has behaved totally irresponsibly of failing to communicate effectively with my constituents. In addition to that, we're only now at the application stage, just pre-application of virtually into the application stage for government assistance to tackle the cladding costs and removal. And then we discover, exactly as other members have said, that large measures of that, large measures are not going to be covered. They're not going to be covered by the grant that the government has set forward. I find it just intolerable that the developer is now coming back and saying all these other defects, which it's equally responsible for, including the wooden balconies, will not be covered in those costs. So therefore, my constituents are feeling they will not be made safe, or if they are, it will be at a high cost to themselves and not to the developers themselves. And in the meantime, as other members have said, they are being hit with increases in their service charges, particularly around the areas of insurance. But yes, there's no way that they can afford themselves the waking watch costs that are being impinged upon them. And can I just say, therefore, like others, my constituents feel lost. They're trapped in their homes. They can't sell on. They're growing families. People trying to move around the country, trying to get a job as a result of the job losses in my area, and can't because they just can't sell on. Their whole lives have been put on hold. So can I just briefly emphasize, other members, there's got to be a sense of urgency from the government now, a clarity about what is covered by the building grant that's been put forward by the government, and to ensure it is a comprehensive cover. Secondly, that all the interim measures now are actually covered. But thirdly, I think there needs to be action from government as well about the control of service charges being imposed upon many of our residents as a result of some of these developers who most of us have lost complete confidence in, even if we had any confidence in the beginning. I close by re-emphasising the distress that this is causing to my constituents. Distress to the point of actually, yes, I think affecting their health. And I think we have a number of mental health crises now as a result of the, not just of what's happened to them as a result of the development of buildings that actually weren't properly regulated, weren't properly inspected, and were faultily built, but also distressed because of the laggard nature of the way in which the government has handled this. I can't stress enough the sense of urgency that there should be at the heart of government to address these issues.
Everyone has been so good, we can splash out and raise the time limit to 3.5 minutes. Enjoy. Mick Whitley.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Holloway, and I thank my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, for securing this important debate. She has long been a passionate supporter of all those who have been so terribly affected by this issue, and I have no doubt that we're all immensely grateful for her tireless efforts. I would also like to pay tribute to our nation's heroic fire and rescue teams who put their lives on the line every single day to keep us all safe. But the fact that we have been forced to have this debate at all is a matter of deep regret. Nearly 4 years after the Grenville fire, the government is still yet to learn the lessons of that tragedy and to take the action that it's so desperately needed to ensure that everyone is safe in their home. Too many people remain stuck in unsafe flats that they cannot sell, pushed to the brink of bankruptcy by the colossal costs of waking watches and cladding removal, and fear of going to sleep each night. In Merseyside alone, there are 25 buildings with waking watches in operation and 65 across the northwest. With the fire safety bill this year, the government's had the opportunity to draw a line in the sand, but that bill failed to go far enough or fast enough, and will have done little to address the very real concerns of the many thousands of people stranded in unsafe buildings. Similarly, the £3.5 billion announced by the Community Secretary simply will not address the scale of this crisis. While it may help people living in buildings over 18 feet, those stuck in smaller housing blocks still face being burdened with the debts that many of them can never even hope to repay. Let's be very clear, leaseholders should not be forced to shoulder the costs of other people's mistakes. But despite saying on no less than 17 occasions that leaseholders will not be forced to meet the costs of fire safety measures, that's exactly what the government now expects thousands of people to do. And the government said nothing about addressing the issue of non-cladding related fire risks, such as wooden balconies, despite considerable risk that these pose to tenants. Finally, Mr Chairman, as we consider the government's failures to step up and ensure the safety of leaseholders, we must not forget the role that 10 years of sweeping funding cuts to frontline fire and rescues have played in the undermining of all our safety. Since the Conservative came to power in 2010, 400 firefighters have been lost in Merseyside alone, and across the country, thousands of more posts have been axed and hundreds of stations closed. The tragic consequences, response times have fallen, and our fire service ability to tackle incidents and save lives critically undermined. Thank you, Mr Chairman.
Thank you. Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, for securing this hugely important debate today and their fantastic contribution, plus their tireless work on these issues, including on the HCLG committee, which I serve alongside her on. Chair, residential leaseholders are the only group involved in the cladding scandal who have no responsibility for the danger they are in every waking minute and when they are asleep. The government, the regulators, property developers, builders, I could go on and on, all have their share of responsibility for the cost of the interim fire safety measures following Grenfell. Yet despite this, leaseholders are still having to pay ever-increasing bills to cover these interim costs, and as we have heard from the heartbreaking testimonies at the HCLG committee, many are experiencing an unimaginable toll on their mental health from circumstances out of their control and not of their making. The lack of clarity from the government is also causing significant distress. And so I hope that the Minister will today be able to provide the further clarity that members and campaigners are asking for. As after 2 hours at the Select Committee on Monday, I was left with more questions than answers about who was actually responsible for this current chaos or who will pick up the tab for sorting it out. Turning specifically to Wake and Watch, this is one of the fastest growing service industries in England, but with no regulation, no cap on costs, there is an increase in bankruptcy and bailiffs up and down the country. These costs that are being passed onto leaseholders and come at the same time as Action for Children reports that 40% of families are struggling to feed their children. I hope that the Minister will outline in his reply exactly what support his department are giving to those having to choose between paying for Wake and Watch or a hot meal for their children. I also expect the Minister to clarify what further support will be provided to those leaseholders who receive universal credit and face the costs of Wake and Watch. The £20 a week uplift pays for around less than an hour of Wake and Watch once a week. It is nearly 4 years since the Grenfell tragedy, and we are still talking about interim measures. The toxic mix of the fire safety crisis and COVID is causing a public health crisis, and this should be recognised by the government. This is not just an industry that needs reforming, but a health crisis that needs addressing. Unaffordable costs heaped on top of the mental torment caused by living in dangerous buildings do not feel interim for those facing them, and it has already inflicted irreversible damage on the livelihoods and well-being of many leaseholders across this country. In closing, I expect the Minister today to not only acknowledge this injustice, but also a commitment to provide the urgent and immediate support needed for those leaseholders. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Paul Blomfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollowbone, and it's a pleasure to contribute to this debate with you in the chair. Can I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, for securing this debate and for opening it so powerfully. I represent several blocks across central Sheffield which are affected by the cladding and fire safety scandal, where leaseholders' lives are being destroyed by the failure of the government to come up with a solution that matches the scale of the problem. The Metis building is one that's gained a lot of public attention, and last night there was a meeting of leaseholders there. 5 weeks after applying for the Waking Watch Fund, there's still no money. Alarms take some weeks to install, so they're facing substantially more Waking Watch costs on top of the £120,000 they've already paid. There's no plan yet for external missing cavity barriers or insulation, which they're told won't happen this year because of the cost estimated at £6.2 million, for which they've been rejected by the Building Safety Fund, meaning they won't get an EWS1 form, leaving their properties unsaleable and facing bills of up to £50,000. Replacement of ACM cladding in Metis is being funded, but I've been contacted by a commercial leaseholder, a small business operating from the building, who is facing a bill of £327,000 to pay the shortfall on ACM remediation because of the cash limits in the scheme. And she fears that will drive her out of business after many, many years. My honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, described the impact of interim costs really well. One of those interim costs is insurance, as the honourable member for Stevenage highlighted. In the Metis building, they faced a 60% increase in their insurance costs, but the situation is worse for residents in the Wicker Riverside complex who were evacuated before Christmas because of multiple fire safety failings. Their building has become uninsurable, exposing them to huge risk and potential breach of mortgage agreements. Now, they met the Building Safety Minister last week, and it appears that the government is relying on a market solution. No market solution is forthcoming. There is precedent for the government to underwrite insurance in such situations, enable a solution. So will the Minister consider such a way forward? The honourable member for Harrow East said that the government shouldn't foot the bill for the failings of others. And he's right. but only the government can act to hold those responsible to account, as the Honourable Member for Bromley and Chislehurst pointed out. And only the government can ensure that these issues are dealt with the urgency that is needed. We should also recognise that the government has much more responsibility than the leaseholders, because they oversaw a flawed system of building inspections which signed off so many of these unsafe buildings. These leaseholders are the victims of comprehensive regulatory failure, and that's why it's the responsibility of government to step in, to own the problem and to resolve it without any costs on leaseholders, either now or in the future through any loans scheme. We're talking about unbearable pressure and unimaginable strain on the young people and families trapped in these homes that are unsafe and unsaleable. The Minister knows there's a grave injustice. He must assure us he'll remedy it.
Thank you. Janet Daby.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a privilege to speak in this debate. I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member of Vauxhall, for securing this debate. We simply cannot raise this issue enough, as it affects so many of our constituents' lives across our country. I have constituents writing to me, as well as parents and friends, writing to me about their loved ones, how they feel trapped, they've fallen into severe debt, they are living in overcrowded situations because they cannot move home, and they're desperately worried about their safety. Residents have been paying waking watch costs, they've seen their insurances rocket, they've seen their service charges increase, and neither should they have to contribute towards replacing cladding, when all of this is no fault of their own. What was once their dream home has become a nightmare. I said this before and I'm saying it again. This nightmare is their reality. This experience is something they live with daily in real financial and emotional terms. Secretary of State's long-awaited announcement last month about support for residents in dangerous buildings fell short of what is needed for the people of our country who are affected by this. Why was the Minister so short-sighted in this, and why was this whole issue absent from the Chancellor's budget? If residents live with unsafe cladding and fire defects, that is no fault of their own. The height of the building should not matter either. The government is not meeting its duty, but it is protecting developers, freeholders and insurance companies. This is what we surmise from this gross inaction. Financial support should not be non-existent for people and their families living in housing blocks beneath 6 stories. The Grenfell disaster took 72 precious lives, and I have to ask, what is the government waiting for before they are motivated to act decently? The actions recommended by both the Phase 1 report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry and Dame Judith Hackett's review are clearly not being carried out at pace. Where did the sense of urgency go? Let me also say this, it is not a pick and mix situation where the government can choose what to remedy and what to not. In my constituency, the residents of the Parkside development have been told by Peabody Housing Association that their remediation work will take approximately 5 years. In this half decade, the residents will be made to pay for these short-term solutions, and I join with my colleagues in saying this is entirely unacceptable. Leaseholders should not have to pay for any shortcomings that they are not responsible for, even for a short period of time. I implore the government to allow my words and the words of others not to fall to the ground. This is about protecting lives, securing a home for people and families, and doing the decent thing up and down our country. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Lyn Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowborn. I'm very grateful, and I'm certainly grateful for the extra 30 seconds. Many thanks to my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, for organising this debate and speaking so brilliantly, opening it. We have the highest take-up of furlough in West Ham, and unemployment is up 240% since the pandemic began. It's grim. This is what people in Newham already face, and all the costs and the stresses of so-called interim fire safety measures are on top of this really difficult reality. Interim means that until their blocks of flats have been certified and, if necessary, remediated, they are in a limbo, and it's proving to be a really long time. Because of these measures, residents are still living with the constant reminder that their building's not safe. It preys on their mind, and they're paying through the nose for the privilege. Zane's block was found to be unsafe, but the original developer of his building is now operating another company, and they've refused to take responsibility. So the costs will inevitably fall to Zane and the other residents of his block. The Minister will know full well what I think about that, and I'd be grateful to him if he could touch on what he might be able to do to help Zane and the other residents out in this circumstance. Before the expensive remediation work even begins, Zane has been faced with massive bills. The insurance premium for the block has rocketed from £3,500 to £280,000. And unbelievably, Zane was asked to cover 2021's bill with 1 day's notice. Then there's the cost of the new alarm system, round after round of surveys, a new managing agency, and even the dreaded waking watch. Overall, that could cost Zane £20,000, probably more. And his building is not a high-rise. So unless the government changes tack, the estimated 40 grand per household for cost of remediation won't be covered fully either. Zane's terrified he's going to have a bill of £60,000 and upwards in total. I can't emphasise enough what a strain this is putting on my constituents, on their lives, on their relationships, on their ability to move on their mental health. And it's so unfair. Government ministers have time and again promised that leaseholders trapped in these situations would not have to pay to fix the problems they didn't cause. But as I've said before, with these interim costs, leaseholders are already paying. And that's why so many people were bitterly disappointed when the government rejected Labour's amendments and the McPartland-Smith one too. I really hope that the Minister today can provide us with fresh assurances that we can pass to Zane and all the thousands of others that this seemingly endless, awful situation will finally be resolved and the government steps up. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen Doughty.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hollowbone. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair, and also thank my honourable friend from Vauxhall for a powerful opening to this debate, and to all colleagues from across the House. They very much reflect the frustrations, anger, mental health worries, financial worries that are experienced by my constituents in Cardiff South and Penarth. I have many of these buildings, a huge series of defects, not just fire safety, but wider building defects, which has been referred to, and the experiences they have had very much reflect those shared by other members today. Just one example away from the fire safety issues, whether it's compartmentation, cladding, foam that's inside the walls of the buildings, the balconies, all of those issues have been touched on already. But there's other issues as well. I discovered in one of my blocks issues with the foul water system, where in some cases the foul water system hadn't even been connected in one of my leaseholders' flats, and as a result sewage flooded into her flat. They found out later it had been propped up on a Starbucks cup. That is what we're talking about here, the levels of defects in the buildings that these people are having to put up with, and it is completely unacceptable, and residents simply should not have to put up with the cost of remediation. It is not their responsibility, it is the responsibility of the original developers who built these buildings, and I've maintained that throughout this. But government must step into act, because it is absolutely clear, as many colleagues have said, of the time that this will take. My residents have also been hit with many interim costs, whether it's the waking watches, whether it's the cost of investigations into materials and the state of walls, but also, as has been mentioned, those insurance costs. And I've met with the ABI to raise concerns about this and the wider industry. The government must work with insurers to ensure that we don't get the situation where insurers pull out and then suddenly residents, as in one of my blocks, are suddenly hit with thousands of pounds in additional insurance premiums that they simply cannot afford, not least in the current pandemic. Many of these residents are key workers, they're struggling, they're people who've retired, they haven't got the money to pay for these bills. I want to welcome the investment that the Welsh Government has promised to put into dealing with these issues. In their budget, as a contrast to the Chancellor's budget the other day, there was a specific section about leaseholders and support for them, and the Welsh Government is going to be making an additional 32 million available to deal with fire and building safety defects on top of the 10.6 million that they've already promised, and they are very clear about their position on this. They've also been putting pressure on developers, and I'm pleased to say that in recent weeks we've seen some movement from Persimmon and Taylor Wimpey, who've both announced different funds. I'm going to be meeting with Taylor Wimpey to understand the full detail of that in the days to come. But I want to come to the Minister. There has been a lack of cooperation with the Welsh Government where there is need for cooperation across the UK. This is a UK-wide scandal. I've repeatedly asked the Minister for details on the new levy, on the new tax, and on what new money will be made available for Wales, and have had one-line answers from him. I hope that he will get around the table with his officials, with the Welsh Government Housing Minister, Julie James, who wants to work in a constructive way, as we've done around the fire safety bill, around the building safety bill, so that we can get a solution that works for the whole of the UK, for my leaseholders and residents in Wales, and get them the answers they need. At the moment, they are left in the dark. They're left with additional worry because they see the Secretary of State making these big announcements, but then brushing away anything to do with Wales. That is not the way to handle this situation. My leaseholders want answers. They want them now. They want justice, and they want to work together cooperatively across the UK to find a solution to their terrible circumstances.
Thank you. Apsana Begum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I want to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, for bringing this important debate to this hall. As the cladding scandal rolls on, it's becoming increasingly clear that the government are not concerned enough with the physical safety or the financial security of those constituents those of my constituents at this moment, living every single day in unsafe housing. The government's positioning around the waking watch measures are just one example of this. Committing to the use of waking watches, as the National Fire Chiefs Council suggests, would mean committing to temporary measures which would go on indefinitely. In their submission to the Public Bill Committee for the Fire Safety Bill, the Fire Brigades Union stated that they were unable to support the use of waking watches in this way for fear that this would become, and I quote, a de facto permanent state of affairs. Temporary measures such as these have been in place since the Grenfell Tower tragedy in 2017. The word temporary is now losing its meaning, Mr. Chairman, and I'd be grateful if the Minister could today address this in his response, because constituents are faced with bankruptcy now, with the cost of waking watches being placed at their door. The other matter I would like to raise is the overwhelming financial burden being placed on leaseholders who are also legally freeholders, and I draw upon the example of the Limehouse West estate in my constituency to bring this to the Minister's attention. Limehouse West was owned by the Canal and River Trust until November 2019, when about 60% of the leaseholders got together to buy the freehold from them. And they did that for a number of reasons. They did it to take charge of their estate, as the Canal and River Trust, as they tell me, were extremely slow to respond and do anything around the estate. And so my constituents did not want to pay the ground rent. But in the context of the ongoing cladding scandal, these constituents being their own freeholders meant, there were some benefits. There was no risk of either Canal and River Trust choosing widely expensive or unnecessary remedial works, and then to saddle these leaseholders with these costs, or the Canal and River Trust doing nothing for years and these flats staying almost unsettable, waiting for the EWS1 certificates. Now, many of my constituents on this estate are both freeholder and leaseholder. The government say that leaseholders shouldn't have to pay a penny. Then who pays for any cladding and remediation works at Limehouse West and other similar estates in my constituency, including interim measures? Because if it's the freeholders, then 60% of my constituents on this estate will bear the cost of the work that will benefit all of them without any means of recovering those costs. And many of my constituents who are freeholder, leaseholder, feel this is very unfair. Now, if it's the original developers that should pay, then there is legally the very difficult problem of making this happen. In the case of this estate, the developer is the absolutely awful Bellway, and Bellway tell me that they will not pay for something they completed over 20 years ago. I'd be grateful if the Minister could help distinguish where leaseholders are also freeholders in response to the costs around interim measures and the wider costs of remediation works itself, and whether he believes there should be parity between the burden placed between freeholder leaseholders and leaseholders only, where the freehold has been brought out by a party that's not related to the original developer in any way. I really do believe the building industry should have to take a greater burden, but in the absence of that, it'd be really great to get that clarification from the Minister. Thank you.
Thank you. Justin Madders.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone. Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I start as well by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, for securing this debate and for the eloquent way she introduced the subject. She went through what she described, what I agree are eye-watering costs, and made the point very powerfully that these costs are there week in, week out until these defects are removed. So can I state for the record my co-chairmanship of the all-party group on common hold and leasehold reform, as well as being a patron of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, who bring their expertise to the APPG and have helped secure many of our experts who between them have put together what I consider to be credible and fair proposals to try and deal with many of the issues that have been raised today. Because as things stand, what the government are proposing is not credible, it is not fair, and it will not deal with the plethora of building safety issues that leaseholders have been lumbered with. So we were told by the Secretary of State when he made his announcement to the main chamber that the government's plans would give certainty to leaseholders. But anyone who heard the Minister's evidence before the Select Committee on Monday will have been left with the impression that certainty is one of the things very clearly missing at the moment. We still do not know who at the end of the day will be the legally responsible body for the remediation. And it looks like there is still a huge risk that it is leaseholders who will find themselves saddled with the debt that they have not consented to and should not be responsible for. The reality is that we have moved from statements that have been made in the past from ministers that there is a strong expectation on freeholders that they will put matters right, to the shameful position we are at now, which is frankly a bit of a muddle, but is looking more and more likely that freeholders will get their assets invested in and brought up to scratch at no cost and at no risk to themselves. And I cannot put any other interpretation on Lord Greenhall's statement on Monday to the Select Committee, and I quote, "We are not asking any of the building owners to make any contribution to the remediation costs," to mean anything other than it is going to be the innocent leaseholder who will end up picking up the bill. If that is where we end up, that surely means that the thousands of pounds leaseholders are paying out now to help keep themselves safe will also be theirs and theirs alone to meet. Despite 2 updates to the Waking Watch guidance and recommendations, the interim alarms are installed. We've had sites which need both Waking Watch and interim alarms for years, costing the leaseholders a huge amount of money. Money it seems they will never get back. After 44 months, there has been no impact assessment on the cost and benefits of these interim measures, and despite the government producing data that they say would allow leaseholders to challenge the reasonableness of these costs, there is no evidence that leaseholders have actually been able to do so in the tribunal. It is also worth pointing out, in addition to these extra costs, that leaseholders have had to find their insurance premiums have also skyrocketed by an average of a financially devastating 400%, even in buildings with no history of fire safety issues. This money is having to be paid by leaseholders every week, and they currently have no prospect of recovering it. These are people who, through no fault of their own, have been left in an impossible position. They deserve our support. They deserve a solution. At the moment, they're having to pay 3 times, once for the property, once for the defects we're talking about at the moment, and also interim measures in the meantime. So when the Minister responds, I want him to tell us where else do people pay 3 times to get the same thing.
Thank you. We now come to the front bench speeches, and I call the Shadow Minister, Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd also very much congratulate my honourable friend and member for Vauxhall in securing this debate today and her continued fight for leaseholders across the constituency. I also want to thank her on focusing this debate on an aspect of the building safety crisis which has received less attention in this House, but it is equally financially crippling, has been argued by my honourable friend, for leaseholders up and down the country. I'd also like to thank the 16 members that have contributed very powerfully to this debate today. The honourable member for Edmonton referred to the astronomical insurance costs piling on leaseholders in the constituency. The honourable member for Harrow East argued that manufacturers that have gamed the testing system should be contributing to paying interim measures and more. While the Honourable Member for West Ham spoke about the nightmare that is the EWS 1 system and debt piling on top of debt in the midst of this COVID crisis. Costs for leaseholders have dominated the headlines over the past few years, nearly 4 years on from Grenfell, where 72 people tragically lost their lives. But this debate today demonstrates the importance of breaking these costs down to expose exactly what is unimaginable debt being imposed upon leaseholders for defects that they did not cause. People are literally going bankrupt. Across the country, leaseholders are trapped in dangerous buildings, unsure of when their home will be made safe or how much it will cost them. But as soon as a building is judged as unsafe, as pointed out by my honourable friend from Vauxhall, the costs start piling up. Additional safety measures, often in the form of 24-hour waking watches, are put in place, and leaseholders have little choice but to foot the bill. Foot the bill or become homeless. £174 million a year. And far from being temporary, as the word interim would seem to suggest, there are waking watches that have now been in place for years and probably even more years to come, costing each leaseholder over £500 per month on average, and in many cases much, much more, as heard across the debate today. After repeatedly refusing to help leaseholders cover these costs, the government has now provided some, I say some, funding to fit alarm systems in some buildings that are 18 metres and above that will reduce the need for waking watch. But once again, the government's actions have come far too late and fall far short in terms of what is needed. We know waking watches are present in around 800 buildings, but the £30 million provided by the government will cover at most 460. That's far lower than the number of buildings, as pointed out by my honourable friend for Vauxhall, in London alone with waking watches. Does the Minister think that when it comes to safety, this type of funding lottery is right? I'm also concerned by reports that even after fire alarms are installed, evacuation managers are still required in some blocks. And again, it's leaseholders that are left paying the bill. Can the Minister say whether he's looked into how many buildings this actually impacts? Safety costs are, of course, not the only interim costs leaseholders are incurring. A survey from Osamor, which the Honourable Member for Amesbury Port and Neston referred to, has found that insurance costs have risen on average by 400%. 1 in 10 blocks, insurance is now 10 times or more what it was just a year ago. A picture that takes us from Sheffield, where a building is uninsurable, to Manchester, to Birmingham, to London, hikes of 1,000% plus are not uncommon. Lord Greenham, the Building Safety Minister, is due to meet insurers with another roundtable yet again this week. Can the Minister confirm whether this roundtable be the one that finally sorts out the problem and intervenes in the insurance market? Ultimately, the only way to stop interim costs continuing is to get buildings safe quickly. But still, leaseholders are left worrying whether, when this day comes, they'll be left with a bill, not just for cladding, but often a whole host of fire safety defects not covered by the Building Safety Fund, as pointed out by honourable members in this debate today. Many buildings below 18 metres will now be saddled with an unwanted loan on top of interim costs, mortgages, service charges and much more. We were promised details of the government's new funding at the budget. but by the Minister himself. But yet again, leaseholders were let down. The Chancellor didn't even bother to mention cladding or the building safety crisis. Will the Minister take the opportunity today to do what Mr Sunak, the Chancellor, didn't do and provide us with details of the new arrangements? And how about updating the Honourable Member for Cardiff South and Penrith on the cooperation with the Welsh governments? Costs for leaseholders go far deeper than the financial cost. As the Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington pointed out, mental health and stress is taking its toll. These are other consequences of the scandal as those bills pile up. Nearly 4 years on, after Grenfell, the very first steps the government should have taken still have not been done, despite our repeated calls. They still haven't established the extent of the crisis and properly prioritised buildings according to risk. They haven't provided sufficient upfront funding to start getting dangerous cladding and other materials off these buildings immediately. They haven't protected leaseholders from the cost, as promised over and over again. And it's about time that the polluter genuinely does pay for the building safety scandal. I do hope the Minister can answer the questions from me and honourable members across the chamber today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I call the Minister for Housing, Christopher Pincher.
Thank you, Mr Holloway. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Lady for Vauxhall and all other members who have contributed so passionately and so eloquently to this debate, speaking on behalf of their constituents. It's a matter that we all care deeply about, Mr Holloway. The consequences of the Grenfell fire were catastrophic for the people and the community involved, and they have been complex and wide-ranging for many, many people across our country as a result. That is why then, since and now, we are taking clear and decisive action, providing an unprecedented sum of money, over £5 billion of taxpayers' funds, into building safety to protect those most at risk. In the short time that I have, Mr Holloway, I'll speak to the issue of cladding remediation and also to the title of the debate, Interim Fire Safety Costs, answering as many of honourable members' questions as I go along. And of course, if I don't complete that task in the allotted time, I'm happy to follow up and write to members subsequently. Now, the biggest cost, Mr Holloway, facing leaseholders affected by building safety is cladding remediation. And it is unacceptable for leaseholders to face those unaffordable costs. That's why we committed £1.6 billion, again of taxpayers' money, to accelerate the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding on the highest risk buildings, those over 18 metres in height, after the Grenfell tragedy. And that was driven by the remediation of the most dangerous form of cladding, as the House will know, aluminium composite material cladding. And I'm pleased to say that as a result of that disbursement, 95% of those buildings with ACM on them, those high-rise buildings with ACM on them, have either begun or completed their remediation work. It's also fair to say, Mr Holloway, that the private sector has stepped up to the plate with respect to ACM, and something like 50% of the buildings, privately held buildings with ACM cladding, have had the ACM removed as a result of the building owners or the developers or the warranty holders acting to replace the cladding. But we haven't stopped there. We recognise that there are other forms of dangerous cladding on high-rise buildings, and we've acted to remediate those through the Building Safety Fund, and something like 500 registered buildings with other types of unsafe cladding are now proceeding with the full application to that fund. But we haven't stopped there. We've also allocated £3.5 billion to remediate all buildings above 18 metres with unsafe cladding on them. An investment which totals over £5.1 billion, and I suspect when all of the taxpayer funds are added up, it will be significantly more money which is being spent by the taxpayer to remediate this problem. I should also like to explain why 18 metres is the threshold trigger. Because it's right that we prioritise those buildings which represent the greatest risk to residents in the case of fire. The Home Office analysis shows that buildings between 18 and 30 metres are 4 times likely to suffer a fire with fatalities or serious casualties than any other apartment building. Building standards become more restrictive over 18 metres. The presumption on firefighting tactics change over 18 metres. It is a well-established boundary used by the National Fire Chiefs Council in their operational guidance, used by the BRE and used by independent expert guidance that we have received. And why cladding, Mr. Hollowbone? It's because we know that it acts as a fire accelerant, and that is of greatest risk in high-rise blocks. That's a fact noted by the independent report by Dame Judith Hackett and the independent advisory panel, and to which Dame Judith spoke in a newspaper article again just a few weeks ago. So that's why we focused on cladding. That's why we focused on over 18 metres. A number of honourable and right honourable members asked some questions during the course of the debate. My honourable friend, the member for Harrow East, asked for some clarification on what is covered by the remediation package that we have tabled. And I can tell him that that remediation package includes works which are integral to the safe remediation and removal of cladding on buildings which are at risk. So they include such things as fire cavity barriers. They too are included in the package if they also need to be remediated as part of the safe removal of the unsafe cladding. The right honourable gentleman, the member for Leeds East, asked me if I would clarify that no leaseholder will be required to fund additional works as a condition of government funding for cladding remediation. I was pleased to answer a similar question that he tabled in written form. I'm pleased to confirm here in the chamber that, as I said then, no leaseholder will be required to fund additional works as a result, as a condition of government funding for cladding remediation. I hope that helps the right honourable gentleman. The honourable member for Cardiff South asked whether we are engaged with the devolved assemblies in Scotland and Wales. Yes, we are. We will continue to discuss the Building Safety Bill with them, and I think that we're meeting them on a monthly basis to do that. The honourable lady, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, asked about leaseholders who are also freeholders and whether they will be able to benefit from the Waking Watch Fund. The answer is yes. And as a result of the package that we have pulled together, Mr. Hollowbone, as a result of the £5.1 billion in public money that we are spending, the tax and the levy that we will impose on the developers, as a result of RICS announcing just a few days ago, in addition to their announcement last November, that the scope of the EWS1 form is going to be significantly reduced. In total, nearly 1 million households will now no longer have to face an EWS1 form, they're effectively de-scoped from the risks that they had previously thought they might face. What we're trying to do as a result of this package, Mr. Hollowbone, and which I think we are being successful in, is persuading the risk industry, the lending sector, that they need to get risk and lending and valuation back into proper proportion. They must put aside the computer says no approach, properly assess the risk of buildings and the fire hazard of them, and properly ascribe value again to them so that people living in those properties can get on with their lives. We're confident that as a result of that package, that is what the risk and lending industry will do, and that we can begin to move on, and that those people in those homes can begin to move on. Mr. Hollowbone, we've also discussed interim measures in this debate, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for addressing the point so eloquently. As I said in my opening remarks, public safety is our first priority, and we want to target funding where it's needed most, removing and replacing unsafe cladding to make the homes and the people that live in them more safe more quickly. We've followed the National Fire Chief Council's guidance to support the installation of Waking Watch, or a common fire alarm, where we need to ensure there are proper measures in place to guard against a tragedy in the event of fire. But we're also clear that these measures are a short-term strategy, a vital first step in ensuring that a building remains safe, but there is no alternative, and they are not an alternative to remediation. Hence the reason why we have spent so much time and are dispersing so much public money to ensure that this problem is properly resolved. Now, too many Waking Watches, as we have heard, have been in place for far too long. Leaseholders are being left to pick up often exorbitant bills. We know, data has shown, that the most cost-effective means of protecting resident safety is through a fire alarm system. That again is evidence based upon guidance published by the National Fire Chiefs Council, and that's why we are providing £30 million to pay for the costs of installing an alarm system in high-rise buildings, again following the guidance of Dame Judith Hackett and others, which have Waking Watch systems where the costs are being passed on to residents, because those buildings are at the highest risk, those residents face the highest costs. The fund opened on the 31st of January in all areas except for private sector buildings in Greater London. The deadline for applications is the 14th of March, and the objective is to install those alarms as quickly as possible. In contradiction to what the Honourable Member for Sheffield Central had to say, we are moving quickly to disperse those funds. £22 million has already been delivered to local or regional authorities because they're best placed to know the buildings which most need local support. In London, subject to a mayoral decision, the Greater London Authority will administer the fund in Greater London, and the fund will open 2 private sector buildings in London on the 18th of March. We felt it was wrong to delay the implementation of the fund and wait for London, which of course has the largest number of high-rise and at-risk buildings. We didn't think that other areas should have to wait. In Birmingham and the West Midlands, for example, Mayor Andy Street has been quick on the case. Other authorities have done the same, and so I encourage the GLA and the Mayor of London to take advantage of these funds, disperse them as quickly as possible to ensure that the people of London facing exorbitant waiting watch funds have the ability to take advantage of this particular opportunity. The Honourable Lady also talked about the number of eligible buildings in London. The National Fire Chiefs Council, again, we're taking, I think, sensible and clear advice, has identified 400 buildings across the country which are at risk of fire and in need of support for waking watch remediation. 216 of those buildings are in London, so that's why we are confident that the £30 million that we have allocated Mr Holloway will be sufficient to deal with the challenge of waking watch in those high-rise buildings where the costs are being passed on to the leaseholder. Mr Holloway, there is a shared desire across the House to ensure that residents are safe in their homes and that leaseholders are protected from unaffordable costs, and that's why we've introduced the scheme, the generous financial package to support leaseholders in buildings below 18 metres. And I suspect that the announcements that Rix has made over the last several months will also support them, and I suspect that the lending industry and the risk industry getting itself back into proper proportion will also support them. I know that debates like this today are vital as we work together to protect leaseholders. And so I want to thank again the Honourable Lady for raising the issue, for speaking so passionately and eloquently in support of her constituents, and for all other Right Honourable and Honourable members for doing the same. This is a crucial issue for us. We will continue to address it, and we will bring forward the Building Safety Bill as soon as possible.
Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Chair. I'm grateful to Honourable and Right Honourable members for their contributions today. They all made excellent points, and I think this highlights the consensus right across the House with all members. And I'd also thank the Minister for his comments. But respectively, the Minister's argument about prioritising a high cost of remediation work is a sideshow, is a false economy and morally bankrupt. We need to look at how we help our constituents now. These interim costs will not go away, and I look forward to writing to the Minister to highlight some of the questions I posed. Thank you.